trust your eyes and ears. Trust your eyes and ears. If I am a cog in a machine working towards a purpose that really has no relevance to myself, my lineage, my progeny, I'm actually being used.
What does it actually cost? And what does it make possible? To move from performing frameworks that you've absorbed to choosing ones that serve your flourishing.
This takes rigorous honesty, actually.
When you say economics should amplify our humanity and expand our sense of possibility, what changes in how we define value? If a friend came to you, someone brilliant, navigating a big career or life decision, what would you want them to see that they probably can't see yet?
I want to go back to what you said about scarcity, and I'm really glad that you brought up that word. I would give them the idea, the premise that what if you already have everything you need right now to move forward? And why? To debunk this idea that I am scarce, that I am missing something.
There's a version of this conversation where people feel inspired for about 48 hours and feel like we've done something and then go right back to where they were before. Where is your thinking genuinely unfinished right now? What question are you living by that you don't have an answer to?
The one that immediately came to mind that I'm afraid to say on this live.
Yes, please share. Please do.
Do you want to hear that I'm asking myself, who am I?
Welcome, everyone. I am Anwulika. I am a transformative development strategist and leadership coach. I'm also the founder of Ijeruka. This is At the Edge, a conversation series where we think alongside people whose work is expanding what's possible. Tonight, I'm in conversation with Dr. Aisha Udochi Amolo, third-generation Nigerian-American economist, educated at Harvard and Howard. Aisha has a way of thinking about economics that I find genuinely reorienting. She doesn't treat it as numbers or markets. He treats it as a study of human expansion, of what amplifies our humanity and what diminishes it. We're going to explore something tonight that I think many of us are living inside, whether or not you'd use these exact words, the economics of cultivating internal authority. Aisha, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's not my first time. It's a little bit like preaching to the choir. I think there's a lot of understanding within this community, even just the need for having these conversations. Nothing can actually flourish or be sustained if we don't have this foundation laid where human dignity is acknowledged, where human potential is allowed to expand. And I'm really grateful that at least in Ijeruka, within this community, we're committed to that and we're practicing it. It's a lot easier to do in community than in isolation. So thank you for creating the space, this container. It's, again, a pleasure to be here.
The thing that you bring that is so resonant with Ijeruka, which is the foundation of everything we do, is we're looking at ourselves. We're turning inwards. We're looking at our own inner architecture and what that makes possible. And at the same time, have the systemic awareness. And so that's what I see in your work. It's, a perfect, in my opinion, encapsulation of this interplay between staying in conversation with our own becoming and at the same time having this awareness and understanding of the world around us and how the logics that we're embedded in and have integrated influence that conversation within ourselves. I actually want to start with not your thesis, but your own story, the shifts that led you here. When you look back at the journey that brought you to this way of seeing economics, what were you unlearning as much as you were learning?
What was I unlearning? I was unlearning this idea that models and equations can define everything, that it's considered everything. And when you take a closer look at economics, you have variables, you even have an error term to account for what you didn't account for explicitly within your model. But even still, the experience of someone like myself, I consider myself an in-betweener. I grew up between Nigeria and the US. A lot of what I see and how I perceive things cannot even be captured by the most quote unquote universal foundational theories and frameworks within economics. So there was a lot of seeing, okay, these are some beautiful theories and some beautiful concepts that in general help us to understand the world around us. But it doesn't seem to explain my world. It doesn't seem to explain really simple things like comparative advantage. If you have a lower cost at producing something, of course you should export to the rest of the world. But in Nigeria, how do you get things in and out? There's a lot of research through the World Trade Organization about the bottlenecks just trying to do business within the continent. And how is that somehow more difficult to do in the continent than if I'm exporting to the US or I'm exporting to Europe? And of course, history can explain a lot of that. So that's where I saw that I had to, because I was interested in applying these frameworks to where I'm from, again, grew up with economists. These are the conversations that we've had since I was small. Development. You can use disciplines to actually improve the world around you. But growing up in a Western-oriented academic space, I also studied in China for some time and in England for some time. I have a global background. So there were some semesters I took in India. There were some semesters I took in Ghana, in Chile, in Peru. And again, it's somehow there wasn't this perfect way of understanding our world. It seemed to defy these theories. So then the kind of question goes so is my reality wrong or is the theory wrong? If I'm not going to even trust my own eyes and ears, I can't deny my own experience. I can't, as we say today, gaslight myself. And even when you talk to people on ground, I'm thinking about, again, when I'm doing my research work in Nigeria, oftentimes those ideas sound really grand, but then there's the reality of our lived situation of what can actually be done. It's so counterintuitive. You wouldn't think. I remember I had a professor who said, this is a complete anomaly when they stopped printing money around the last election. He said that has never happened. He's never heard of any country that's ever done that. And he was like, this is an incredible opportunity to even do research because you control the variable, which is a circulation of money. But who does that? Who stops printing money in a country? In Nigeria, we do. So it's just like these sorts of things that you can go to school and study it, and then it doesn't line up with your lived reality. You then have to ask yourself, again, is it the theory that's right, or is it my eyes and ears? And one of the things that I want to emphasize in this conversation is that trust your eyes and ears. Trust your eyes and ears. So often we're being told by people who maybe think are well-meaning, but they can only help you through their own lived experience. I started to see that the quality of the knowledge production, because there's this missing gap that's coming back from where I'm from or my experiences, I actually started to see, the quality of knowledge isn't that great.
I heard you say a few things. First of all, there is, I think for all of us, beyond economics and entering into the world of inner development, there is this perceived safety in frameworks and models and having these pre-packaged ways that we're meant to understand the world and live our lives. You start to distrust your own voice and your own perception, your own experience, your own intelligence, right? You're waiting on other people to legitimize that experience and that knowledge, not just from you, but from literally the world that you come from. The quality of the knowledge is not that great. And we're seeing it reflected in the quality of our collective experience. And so that tells us something. That tells us that we can't depend on what we've been depending on. And so all of us have to find it within ourselves to start generating new insight, new knowledge, new ways of being, even if you just begin with testing it with yourself first. I want to get to, in this conversation, how we actually get there, because it's easy to say, right? It's very easy to say these things. But first, let me just ask you a bit more about our world. What do you mean by that?
World. So in economics, I remember my 101 class. This is at Stern freshman year. And the professor would put up the US, Europe, and then ROW. That stands for the rest of the world. Pretty simple. Again, it's better. It's easier when you're explaining concepts to break it down simply. But that's also really symbolic, because while he's saying US, Europe, and the rest of the world, for somebody like me, I don't only identify with that Western place. I might be sitting in your classroom. I'm an in-betweener. I'm an in-betweener. That's what I identify with.
Yeah. Yeah. There's more that's available to us. There's a wide spectrum of ways of understanding and engaging with the world beyond just, in this case, the West or Western civilization, because the different civilizations that we're embedded in and the logics and things that they produce, we often don't see them and we take them for granted, but they're at play. And so I think what I'm hearing you say is that acknowledging my world, our world, as being more than just the rest of the world and actually being the center has been a key part of your shift in being able to understand and engage with your discipline and the work that you're doing differently.
Yeah, I'll just add, Samir Amin, another fantastic economist, talks a lot about the center and the periphery, and he breaks down how colonialism works and the impact on, especially on North Africa. So basically, the issue with how we live or how we've been living the past 400, 500 years is that the center, due to colonialism, has focused our views on what's happening in the metropoles, aka the Western world, but my world, and I think for a lot of people, our world is that periphery. And the funny thing again is that somehow the periphery, the rest of the world, that is the majority of the world population, has become peripheral to what's happening here. So again, it's almost like taking the blinders off of what's happening just here as if that's all that matters. For a lot of people, we do not have a choice. Our survival and our sanity actually depends on it. So again, if I'm a student and you are telling me something that doesn't line up with the reality of when I'm going home or when I'm visiting family or I'm doing work in another country, then I have to say, am I going to trust my eyes and ears? Like when I was working in China, totally shocked how that went, because that was an entire system that did not rely on anything Western and adapted it to their environment. So am I going to, just because we're told that democracy is what works, free markets are what works, even though that's not fully practiced in the West also. So that's just a technical thing, like full democracy, free markets. Does that mean that I'm going to discredit a country that's able to lift millions of people out of poverty, provide employment, provide basic social welfare? No. So I'm just saying that this sort of concept of internal authority it's a lifelong, I believe, practice. For some historically marginalized groups, I think there's a little bit of if we're at the edge, there's an edge that we actually have because of that adversity of having to make sense and wrangle with the reality that often, again, shifts our lived experience to the periphery.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right in everything that you said. I'm also interested in the reference points that you have for the way that you think about economics, about, the center and periphery conversation. So you were trained, like we said already, at Harvard and Howard. And those are two, institutions that are admired, respected in many ways, and yet they have some tensions and difficulties that come along with them and what they produced in the world, both of them, right? So can you talk about those two very different intellectual traditions? How did holding both shape what you could see?
Howard, it looks like I came a couple decades too late, because by the time I came in, a lot of the radical 60s and 70s energy where they were training students in law so that they could work in civil rights and advocate for the Black population and businesses and getting them involved in lobbying. Howard is in Washington, D.C., so the proximity to a lot of these really critical institutions that shape the nation are there. And then the historical persecution of Black people in this country, they were churning them out. By the time I came, so this is going to be 2019, by the time I arrived, that really electric energy was dim. Let's just say it's dim. And I had the pleasure of studying under Professor William Spriggs, who was a very prominent economist, especially when it came to labor economics, and was very active. So he didn't just stay in the classroom, and I loved that. Part of boards, speaking to labor unions, and, a public intellectual. and he was born on Howard University's campus at their hospital, but he explained the energy that we have today is not of the past. So when we're talking about kind of the school of thought there, I think there's a romanticization of what Howard was. I actually thought it was going to be like that. But what I do appreciate about Howard is that it understands that we need to be in the rooms. With Harvard, I won't forget, we was a human rights delegation. We went to New York from the Kennedy School and we were talking to the UN. And one of the representatives said, at the end of the day, this is the United Nations, but these are just people representing countries. And if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. This bridge that I started to draw between the frameworks that are used to build nations somehow mirror like inner and human development. Because again, that's really great that we have this Washington consensus and this beautiful way of quote unquote developing nations. And then we can get into the intricacies of that because again, who made it? Who does it really benefit? You know, are you the rule maker or the rule taker? Like that's another important thing to kind of understand.
You said something that is so fundamental, which is the way that we are building the world or that we approach nation building, world building, all of these things. It is reflected in how we build ourselves, essentially. So that's where I want to zoom in. And I heard this polarity as you were speaking. The thing that I feel like is common to all of us that are pursuing things of consequence is on the one hand, the resources, power, what seems like abundance, right? And is concentrated in certain places and in order to access it, you talked about the cost. You talked about the cost financially, but I'm also interested in like the human cost, the internal cost, because so on the one hand, there's resource, there's abundance, there's access, there's power, there's being in the room. And then on the other hand, what many of us are navigating is that in order to access all of those things, it feels like you have to, one, legitimize a system that you might be actually against in some ways that you don't all the way agree with. And so there's some stuff there. There's there's the fact that you will put yourself in a position potentially to constantly be having to find ways to guard your own voice and your own inner knowing, essentially, because everything around you will be telling you it's incorrect, it's illegitimate. And that can be a really difficult dance. And I'm interested to know specifically how you have navigated that. How have you navigated that paradox of I need to be in the room, and at the same time, being in the room feels like it has a real cost that erodes, and at times, even my own, let's say, conviction for some people. You might fight to get into this space, and then once you're in this space, like, you find yourself sacrificing and compromising. And not to say that those are entirely bad things, but how do you actually hold that?
Okay. For me, the cost was and is huge. I do not thrive in these environments. So corporate, I'd love to do a consulting project with you. Love your facility, incredible buildings, AC blasting, that's fantastic. I love all those things. But for me, I don't believe in a suffering artist. I don't believe in a suffering intellectual. I don't believe that I need to suffer in order to produce good work. Personally, I don't play that game. I do not play that game. And I also have seen people who've been able to create incredible careers for themselves and live off of their intellect and their contribution to humanity, answering questions. The most powerful thing that I've found in my academic career and what has really informed how I approach economics, development, business development, inner development, any of the clients that I'm working with has actually been this interesting thing where when I study something that pertains to me, my future, my world, my community, I actually strengthen myself. I would always get this thing of when I go home, when I'm beaten by the sun, when I'm like taking in the air, when I'm talking with my family, when I'm understanding what is affecting them, when I'm finding out what matters to my lineage, where I'm from, what's needed in the village to make things better and more habitable and give opportunities, then I feel like strengthened, basically. Because if I am a cog in a machine working towards a purpose that really has no relevance to myself, my lineage, my progeny, I'm actually being used And I think that's the inner energetic, cellular pushback that I have when I'm in the room and I'm just there. I'm not there for their sake. I believe that I am here for a purpose and I have access to certain things for a purpose. It's not for my own self-enrichment. Why? Because I actually think that that's too small to be thinking. Once it's about tapping into mission, purpose, direction. And again, I feel like when I talk to people, whether they're running a business or their individual client, one-to-one sort of situation, when that person feels lost, what is it all for? I'm earning. I'm earning. I have this. It's even a nice degree, but it's not being harnessed towards something that matters. It's something of consequence to me. I have to be able to use the resources in a way that pushes that something slightly larger than myself.
Within Ijeruka, I've come up with this framework, something called your personal flourishing thesis, right? And just for anyone who's listening to this, you don't have to take anything that's said here today as gospel, right? So don't take everything that's shared as you have to agree with it. The point of this session is to actually understand how someone like Aisha, or Aisha specifically, in her journey in building this very different approach to an established discipline of economics, right? She sees it fundamentally differently than most of the people in the field do. What does that actually take and what does it look like in practice? So what I'm hearing from you, Aisha, in your personal flourishing thesis is that you have to have some sort of connection to something beyond yourself. The pursuit of success, however that's defined, alone is not sufficient. It has to be contributing to some sort of collective good, it sounds like, for you. It has to be nourishing for you. And so there's this thing of, on the one hand, I feel like these are the contradictions that we're always dealing with, right? This is what we're dealing with day in, day out in our lives. On the one hand, we say, be in the room, don't be the meal, basically, be at the table. And on the other hand, we're also saying that, okay, well, there's a cost to that. There's a cost to trying to be at the table on those terms, right? And in your actual lived experience, you have seen that when you step away from the table and you're actually just living your life and you're in your community and you're doing things that maybe are not recognized and maybe are not the priority of these major institutions that you're a part of or you have access to, but they're a priority to you. That's what's actually giving you a sense of fulfilling your personal flourishing thesis. Even when you speak, that's where the expansion is coming from. I think that most of the people who come to Ijeruka are drawn to this because we're purpose-driven to an extent. We are, whatever your field is, even if it's real estate or whatever, you are driven to do something meaningful. How you define that meaning, how you determine the success of it, that's where we struggle. I also want to just name, even if you're doing this into this wrestling, right? There's a power in noticing that the lenses that you have are just lenses. You talked right at the beginning about you're trained in a particular way of understanding economics, way of understanding development, even when you have not made a full shift to it's not as if you're okay, I'm not going to go to Harvard, I'm not going to go to these places, I'm not going to show up at the UN. It's not as if you're abandoning all that. But the power has come from the fact that you can see that the lenses that you were given to understand the world around you are just lenses, and they can be taken off and they can be replaced with something else. So let's go there. Let's talk about what becomes possible when you can see a lens as a lens.
What becomes possible, everything becomes possible. And I like to say truth is a kaleidoscope. It has many different lenses. So what I'm actually doing, and I think you said something it may not be a priority to, one of my professors, or he's oh, that's a cute project, or da-da-da-da, but it's a priority to me. I actually do think it's a priority to you. Do you want to have a field that's producing cutting edge work that's at the frontier?
I want to push back on that. Let's say that person that you're trying to have that conversation with and say, hey, look, I can see that, it should matter to you. It does matter, even if you can't see. My lens is expanded, right? I have the kaleidoscope, let's say, right? That person that says to you, oh, that's cute, that's a nice project. and you feel this thing within you of, it's not just a nice product and it's not just relevant to me, it's relevant to you. If you cannot persuade that person, right? Or are you going to expend your energy? Are you going to expend your energy trying to get them to see it that way? Or are you just going to keep moving forward? How do you approach that? And can you move forward even if the people around you and the systems that you're embedded in don't see it the way that you see it, will never see it the way that you see it, or take much longer? How does that affect you? How does that approach the way that you navigate your own calling and your own mission, or even the way that you relate to your own insight?
What I'm finding is that I'm personally not a convincer. Persuasion, debates, that is not my thing. Debate is a beautiful art form. It's not one that I participate in. That being said, money talks. So this is also the other thing. So economics is about resources, the flow of money, things like that. Again, if I'm taking it from a less, maybe I'll say like emotional point of view, if I'm taking it from a, like when I'm talking to businesses, a money-making point of view, like I was talking with an AI company, if you want to improve your language learning model, but you don't have data or there's nothing on to inform the models from African scholars, Black experience, artwork, images. This is not the generative AI that you are selling this to be. This is actually false advertising. This is incomplete. And it's quite interesting because one of the things I have noticed is that may not be the goal in some situations.
You don't know
at all.
That's so important. You don't know what all of this comes down to. You don't know what other people's goals are, right? Like in coaching, you can have a view of what is right for the person. But one of the fundamental things in coaching is that you cannot dictate the direction or what is right for your client. What success is based on what their goals are, what their intentions are. And there's surface goals. So there's, the things that we say that we want to accomplish. And then there's deep intention, right? And when you're engaging with someone and you have your lens, you have your intention, right? Like you have your goals and then you have your intention. You don't know what theirs are, right? You can ask questions, you can engage with them to try and figure it out. How do you figure out whether or not the person that you believe that you need to persuade, or the collective of people, or even the system, right? The system that you're in, what the true intentions, what the purpose of it is? Because that will help you orient and figure out how you should expend your energy or how you should relate to it and how you make your own choices as a result.
I think at the individual level, that is entirely true. Yeah. So talking to somebody one-on-one, and at the commercial level, so like the level of enterprise, if I'm talking with business owners, usually the goal is to make more money. It's usually to increase their revenues. One of the things that I have found that is surprising and shocking when we look at maybe at the level of countries and how you're actually guiding your society, it may not be for cutting edge knowledge and human development and actualization. And I absolutely do not contend with the system trying to convince to value certain knowledge or contributions once I understand that, that is not at all the goal. And of course, the goals of the Maldives may be different from the goals of China, may be different from the goals of Nigeria, may be different from the goals of the US. So there's a lot of things that can impact what is a priority for a nation. And if I'm going to be just like very blunt, yes, some systems are designed not to necessarily have these self-actualized citizens. It's to have good laborers and employees. So I don't need you to be thinking out of the box or contributing to different communities or producing cutting edge research. Like even war, we're watching that happen, what the U.S. is involvement in this latest situation. And a lot of people, like you would think, oh yeah, of course you want world peace and you want stable markets and you want trade flowing, but there's somebody perhaps who's benefiting a lot from the industrial complex of decimating entire populations of people. So it can seem counterintuitive in some contexts, but, upon digging deeper, it's like, okay, like, right, this is not the person who's going to understand the value of this. And again, that's also strategic. If you devalue where you get your resources from, you simply are cutting your costs. Let's just take cocoa from Ghana. All of the money comes from the value add of it being Swiss chocolate, but the very material that you're using, you're going to price at the least cost. You would not have Swiss chocolate if there was no cocoa to begin with. I think part of what's beautiful studying African economics and why it applies to human development is that we live in a time where a lot of structures actually work very hard to devalue you. But part of what the African experience is this remembering and actually really recognizing there's so much value here. One of the things that I'm really interested in, again, going back to that wealth generation, is how do I identify these almost like hidden economies within myself, this hidden prosperity within myself, and harness it for my own good. But one of the things that's really beautiful when you start learning about other schools of thought, especially indigenous ways of organizing society, and I think a lot of practice of apprenticeship in Igbo land in Nigeria is this: instead of dominating and taking more from myself, I could just grow the pie. Instead of having a bigger slice of the pie, I could just grow the pie, and that's something that is not practiced. But these are some of the approaches and frameworks that I utilize with my clients, be it on the individual level, with businesses, or at the national level. But that requires you to have a lens where you value something that has traditionally been devalued.
Yeah. You have surfaced something super important, which is understanding the logic, like the cultural logics behind how you see something as simple as value. When you said that, how can you devalue the cocoa that is necessary for the chocolates, But there's a reasoning behind that, right? And you need to understand it. You need to understand it, because when you don't understand it, when you're not able to see these underlying ways of thinking, you just end up absorbing them and never really questioning them. And then they impact how you see yourself, how you approach your work, how you understand the world around you. So part of what you're doing and what it seems like your journey has been fundamentally about getting to the heart of what is the mind behind this discipline that I'm a part of, right? How do they actually think about something like value? How do they think about, where they place that value? And how does that then impact me? How does that then impact the people that I work with, the spaces I'm contributing to? So I really love that came through. But then specifically on the point of view of what African intellectual tradition, cultural traditions as well can give us. Two things that I heard you say. One was about going back and remembering. I mean, obviously, like immediately my mind goes to the concept of Sankofa, which I think is one of the philosophical traditions that people may be familiar with. If you're not familiar with it, that's totally okay. We'll share some resources on that. If you're a member of Ijeruka, you can access some of those resources. The concept of being able to go back and fetch knowledge. Also, we're not always moving forward in time, that there is wisdom to be found in our heritage, in our past, and that can actually inform the way that we engage with the world. That's the first thing. The second thing that you said is like, it sounds so simple, but you can just expand the pot. Why do we not think this? Again, this is just one of those things it's unexamined. The dominant logic that we are embedded in tells us that there's scarcity, right? That there's not enough. And yet, if you're able to see it as a lens, then you can treat what we're saying as legitimate. Like this is something that is available to you, which is that you can actually just see it as you can expand the pot. Scarcity is not necessarily the truth of our reality. It is a narrative. It is one form of reasoning. It's not the single truth. But again, I'm sure that even as we say that, people will feel something within themselves and it's like you might recognize it or even want to accept that, but then embodying it, practicing it, integrating it, letting it change the way that you actually engage with the world around you, that is difficult. That's a real challenge. So actually that brings me to my next question. We've been tracing how Aisha came to see economics differently. Now I want to explore, like I said earlier, what that different seeing makes available. So Aisha, you describe economics as being about human expansion. Can you make that real for us? If a friend came to you, someone brilliant, navigating a big career or life decision, what would you want them to see that they probably can't see yet?
What would I want them to see that they likely cannot see?
Yeah.
I want to go back to what you said about scarcity, and I'm really glad that you brought up that word. I would give them the idea, the premise that what if you already have everything you need right now to move forward? And why? To debunk this idea that I am scarce, that I am missing something. And again, I mentioned this at the top of the conversation. This is actually a lot easier to do in community, to be a mirror to somebody else, to actually say this out. And there's a lot of research, especially around complex PTSD and how you heal that. And it's literally just being in community, being able to speak and say your truth, because there's so much that is suppressed in silence. And I do want to touch on when you said like the remembering part as well. Sometimes in order to cope with our circumstances, we engage in selective amnesia. You see this at a cultural level and at like a societal level where maybe there was a horrible authoritarian leader that led to a lot of crisis economically and within the society. But somehow decades later, we're electing somebody who's espousing the same very dangerous rhetoric of that past day, written in history. Truth and reconciliation forums had to be held. But that's one of the ways that we actually cope, by forgetting. The issue is that sometimes when you forget, you suppress very real markers of yourself that actually help you to navigate like the world and kind of forge that unique path that we all have as individuals, as one of 8.4 billion people in the world that happen to be comported the way that we are, as in we're acting as a prism to a very specific expression of, you know, if you believe in a creator or a higher power, of that higher power for a purpose. So it really comes down to, I would say, this remembering and this debunking of the idea that things are scarce. Because I saw in the chat, like this, you know, mentioned the Igbo apprenticeship system. Exactly. Like, isn't that so interesting that it's a super simple concept? Imuafia, it was one of the means of Igbos actually surviving in abject poverty and deprivation during the genocide of the Biafran War. Like, that's what it was. I will take you in. You will train under me. Instead of having destitute people everywhere, I will take you in. You will train under me. You will work for me. You will learn the skills. 7 to 8 years later, I will give you a lump sum to go and start your own business in that field that you trained in, and you will do the same. That actually grows the amount of employment and opportunity, as well as hard cash that somebody has on their hand to now even participate in an economy on their own without being dependent. So it's a really different approach. There's a scholar called Johann Galtung. He talks about structural violence. Violence is not just that which is committed to you physically. When there are ideas that abrogate, meaning limit your human potential, because you think, oh, I can't do that. But yeah, they're not going to accept my application. Oh yeah, literally, I cannot move because this is my passport color and I cannot get a visa. This is abrogating human potential, and it's violence. It's structural violence. These things are very real, and I have to do the work of keeping my mind open to the possibilities of harnessing what I have. And I think the biggest feat that one gets is when you win that psychological war against somebody, to even encourage them to not even fight, to encourage them to not even believe.
You said winning the psychological war that encourages someone to not even fight. Winning the psychological war that enables you to fight back. And I don't want to use the language of fighting necessarily, even though that's what it can feel like sometimes, and that's real, but that allows you to expand your range, let's say, and access alternative ways of seeing that are conducive to your own flourishing. Doing that, getting there, is not easy and shouldn't be done alone. And I like that you've mentioned a few times in this conversation that the community and collective having support is fundamental, because no, we're not saying at any point in this conversation that you should be able to do this on your own. And in fact, that's something I'm really conscious of, is that there's a version of this conversation where people hear expand beyond the dominant logic and feel inspired for about 48 hours and feel like we've done something, and then go right back to where they were before, the metrics they were using before, the ways that they were understanding before. And so part of what I'm interested in is like, what actually makes the shift stick? When you say economics should amplify our humanity and expand our sense of possibility, what changes in how we define value?
Turning it on the lens towards myself, I now start to look at specifically like intangible things of value. So my attention has value and power. And then if you want to get really like micro with it, I could actually talk about the real energetic weight. Like now we're getting into physics of why my attention has value, and hence why there's so many books out there right now. The war for your attention, the attention economy, because that they figured out a way to harness that into dollars. So it's so interesting how a business has figured out how to harness that into dollars, but me, myself, that's not aware of the value of my own attention, cannot harness it to benefit myself. There's that. There's the value of my energy. Where am I spending my time? How am I spending my time? Again, information age. I could be spending my time on anything. So actually that means that what I now choose to spend my time on is either really, really valuable to me, especially when there's so many options and there's these days. But then I have to say, does that actually align with my ethos, my values, the world that I essentially imagine to be like the ideal place I would want to be existing in? I kind of have to understand basically that I am part of the world that I'm existing in. Like I do play a role, whether it's with the sorts of ideas that I choose to amplify, the beliefs that I have, my own value system when I don't interrogate it. This takes rigorous honesty, actually, to do these assessments. It's uncomfortable when you're going in and you're looking at the financials of a business and it's like, okay, so like how much were you paying that person? And oh, you lost that amount of money. And then you actually have a honest account of the assets and liabilities in order to help the business thrive from using real information. So it's obviously it's not comfortable or easy to do. But I mean, I've gotten to a point where I've just got to say there's no shortcuts in life, not even with your emotions. You can't even get away really with lying to yourself and convincing yourself, no, this is fine. I'm totally fine with this. I don't want to go on and on. But I would just say when you're turning the economics lens onto yourself, you're actually going to start looking at a lot of intangible assets that you have. And then you'll be able to see, by how I'm harnessing those intangible assets like my time and my attention, what does that actually say about my values? And does that really align with the world that I want to live in and contribute to?
I love that you included one, intangible assets, but also the rigorous self-honesty. That to me is really key. When your internal compass points in a different direction from what the people around you expect, the community that you love, the institutions that you're a part of, what does internal authority actually require in that moment? And how do you assess the cost of it, of maintaining your coherence?
I will change. I should change. I should evolve. Okay. So I believe that because that's part of the expansion process.
Yes.
And then on top of that, if I'm practicing internal authority, there's a rigorous honesty that I have to have with myself in order to do this evaluation, to make sure that I'm actually staying on a track that means something deeply to me, that is satisfying. That's very, very important. So now if my world around me is communicating something contradictory to like how I'm moving, I would say that I have to consider what my world is saying because it's feedback. Like I mentioned this thing about community and how much easier it is to do this sort of work in community because they are a mirror. It's possible that they've got it all wrong and I have this invention, they just don't get it, that is actually doing a lot more for them than they know. And I've been in situations, I've seen people talk about this, killing the messenger, for example. But there are some times where this is not about we're shooting the messenger. Oh, you just don't like it because I'm speaking the truth or I know what you need. It could be that I'm not listening to the feedback that I'm receiving. And that is actually really important information for me to integrate and actually continue in this process of like evolution and expansion. So that's where I would say this, again, discernment, rigorous honesty has to happen. It's really a skill. I think especially today as an individual, I really do have to do that due diligence on my own to know, okay, am I truly pioneering an idea or a solution that can help somebody more than myself? Like, it's not just about my self-enrichment and I must do this at all costs, or it's that somebody is trying to communicate something, like my world is giving me feedback.
Yes. If I can just double click on that. One of the things within Rising Rooted, the upcoming fellowship program for EJ that we talk about, the fellowship is about mastering self-authored leadership. But the distinction that's really important to understand is that that does not mean that you cut out everyone else. We exist in relation to other people, and there's value in that. There's genuine value in that. And there's wisdom to be found in community. And you can only expand your wisdom by being in conversation and taking seriously what other people have to offer. But the challenge is, like you said, it's a capacity that you cultivate. I would say capacity and not skill, because I think skill is about what comes after you've built the capacity of discernment and relational intelligence. Skill is how you then express that outwardly. That's something that you cultivate over time. And so internal authority, please understand this distinction, is not about individualism. It's not about my voice is the only one that matters. But part of what we've been doing in this conversation is showing the scaffolding, showing that process. So you start with just seeing the lens, right? So you can look at the situation, you can assess let's say the problem at hand, right? The dilemma at hand, and understand that you have a particular lens that is going to inform the way that you see this, right? And so does everyone else around you. The shift comes when you can actually, like we've already said a few times, you can recognize that this is not the only truth that exists. And so how do I hold this? Most people don't even get to that stage, right? A lot of us are just moving through completely unexamined. But in this conversation, I feel like it's really important that we bring that up, because if we're talking about African and Afro-diasporic developmental traditions, part of what our traditions have taught us is we do not consider people to be wise leaders or to have matured. This is actually a fundamental distinction, because I'm studying adult developmental psychology from the Western perspective as well. And in the Western traditions, you are more matured by how much more individualistic you get, right? Like how much more into yourself you become, right? And that's not necessarily how African and Afro-diasporic traditions treat that. We actually see it as the opposite. The more that you can handle the complexities of communal life, the more that you can learn the wisdom, the skill, the interplay of honoring your own voice, honoring your own calling, your assignment, your unique wisdom that's cultivated through your experience, through your discernment, your knowledge, in relation to other people, and figure out how to, it's an art, the art of being in conversation with your own becoming and with the community. That is what counts as a wise leader or a wise person, a matured person. That is what we consider to be a sophisticated individual, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually. So again, it's not to say one is right or the other, but these, again, just know that these are different ways of understanding growth, change, leadership. You need to see that there are many different ways to view the world and to move through the world, right? Okay. Last question, Aisha. Where is your thinking genuinely unfinished right now? Where is your thinking genuinely unfinished right now? What question are you living inside that you don't have an answer to?
So I have like the one that immediately came to mind that I'm afraid to say on this live.
Yes, please share. Please do.
Do you want to hear that I'm asking myself, who am I? So, I mean, that's pretty, but if I'm honest with you, I've experienced a lot of changes in the past few years, and a lot of it has to do with what we've discussed in this conversation, especially when you're applauded for a certain identity and then that identity starts to shift. So, and then I kind of see, okay, I was associating who I am with this thing, but now I'm no longer this thing, or I don't have this title, or I'm not doing this practice. And so who am I? So yeah, I would definitely say I'm in the liminal space of transition, but I do want to just plug this really quick. Like you mentioned, how do you keep this practice going? This is a practice, and it's definitely through repetition. So like repetition is the mother of learning. And one of the things I wanted to do with this community to engage better and as gratitude is I wanted to offer a one-on-one with two of the participants.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, just for a chat to like discuss this practice of inner development and explore, again, that thing of just giving back to the community. Because there's something to being able to even ask these questions. The fact that I can even say this in this sort of space where we're contending with identity, authority, movement, the self, it's that alone is very humanizing. And that alone is really grounding and ultimately is a help. So I just wanted to offer that to the stage. So I don't know how we can get that out there, but
we'll sort it out. We'll sort it out. Aisha has been a regular contributor, one of the voices of the village. So this is an absolute gift for whoever ends up receiving this. So we'll work together to figure out that, but it definitely will happen. And just want to say thank you for offering that.
I would also be curious to ask you, like, what is the unfinished question that you have right now? You said that you're engaging with adult developmental psychology, which is incredibly interesting. Yeah, what's coming up for you?
Gosh, you really put me on the spot. No, I have a lot of unfinished questions, so I'm just trying to like, but you know when someone asks you and then you go blank, so just bear with me. Okay, an unfinished question that I have. I know. So I actually was rereading my thesis that I wrote years ago on the politics of imagination and nation building. And one of the things that came through as I was rereading it is I wrote a lot about coming to consciousness and essentially the process of like taking the lens off and, you know, being able to bear witness, being able to see yourself, see the system that you're embedded in. But the difficulty that where I didn't get to go, and I don't think I had the capacity to do it at that time, was, so what happens once you like can see things clearly or you can see things differently? Like what actually comes next? Because the challenge that came up, one of the insights that I wrote about in my thesis at the time was many of the people that I interviewed who were engaged in various types of social transformation initiatives and social justice initiatives were actively and vigorously pursuing their objectives while at the same time saying that it's impossible to change things. And so this is actually the basis of everything that I'm doing right now, which is it's not enough to just generate insights. How do you make that shift towards integration? How does it then fundamentally transform you and the world around you? And I'm calling this building creative will. And I'm looking at like the architecture of building creative will, of the architecture of possibility. Back then I was exploring the architecture of imagination. And I think fundamentally it's like, again, it's always going to be this back and forth between like the self and where the self meets, you know, everything else. But I don't even think that division, that division is a true representation. So you can already hear like there's so many things that I'm kind of like exploring at the moment, but in practice, like in actual practice. And I believe in the unfinished question, not just being a question that I am engaging with intellectually, but I'm engaging with through my work, through my coaching, through my learning design, facilitation, which is, how do you go from generating insight and bearing witness, taking off the lens, to then something that fundamentally changes the way that you engage with the world and moves us, not just that, but like actually moves us collectively towards something that's qualitatively better. So I hope that made sense.
It does.
Yeah.
You know, as soon as you answered the question, I was like, yeah, once you can see the system, I think what happens when you are not in community is the typical disposition is to become very jaded and pessimistic and nihilistic. because you see that machine that is just crushing people and souls, and as well as yourself. And then you ask yourself, what do I do? But I feel like I'm just looking in the chat, and thanks so much for everybody's engagement. And yes, these are extremely big ideas. And at the same time, like, I consider these ideas and questions matters of the soul, to be honest. And in like traditional and ancient communities, these would actually be like rites of passage work that is done. So that's also why I keep saying this is not meant to be done in isolation. It's actually like at your own risk if you do it in isolation. Yes.
And it's so funny because I literally first, Ijeruka is on a hiatus. For those of you who don't know, Ijeruka is on a hiatus for a year. And I took a time out because I needed to go through my own rights. And one of the first posts I wrote, like reintroducing this work and this new chapter, was about flourishing is not just about what we can reach for, it's about what we can hold. And a big part of our capacity to hold is the process that we go through and the ways that our community comes in to help us cultivate those capacities, right? Like these rites of passages. And so a big part of it is that Ijeruka is essentially trying to provide that kind of like modern day, village with these rites of passage, with the growth partners, because you can't see your own back, and many of us are doing these things in isolation. So I actually really appreciate you using that particular framing, because that's exactly how I see, Ijeruka, and see the work that we're doing is like you're providing a contemporary space that acts as the village community, the rites of passage, the support, the griots, right? Like we are essentially also our griots playing that role as well. And this is what it looks like, guys. This is what it looks like in this day and age.
Just added asterisk to when you said like the community is there to help you hold, like I think I don't know, maybe early 2010s started really engaging with different communities. And I appreciate the community helping me hold the terror and the horror of the day, like trying to grapple and make sense of what this is. At the same time, again, I need to learn how to hold goodness, possibility, hope. That is, again, as you're saying, you made the distinction between skill and capacity. So I'm just saying there's a lot to be done in this process, not only just holding the brute realities of the world, but also the possibility of what currently actually is, like when I look within and I can assess my own intangible assets and then what can be. Yeah. These are all practices. It's not done overnight. It's not done from like one, retreat. It's pretty much a way of life. But I think that when we engage in it that way, we start to experience the satisfaction that we were always meant to have.
So Rebecca says, I'm just reflecting on how much this conversation resonated. So thank you so much for this. I'm sitting with how we surface the values and perspectives in community around purpose or collective view. Capitalism aligns through metrics like profit, GDP. But what else could we organize around? What do we want to put these resources towards? Human needs, expression, self, community, actualization. So she's giving some options there. Aisha, yeah, go ahead.
And that's why I say it's like speaking to the choir here, because even when I talk to other economists, they don't get it. Actualization, what's that? Because now I'm actually bringing in some like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary sort of work to understand what Rebecca's saying exactly. Because essentially, when you only focus on bigger, more, growth, you actually cannibalize yourself, cannibalize the communities that you're trying to get money from. Like if you're decimating their environment, if you're overfishing, if you're crowding out small businesses, okay, then there actually isn't that engine of capitalism to even sustain itself. So yeah, that's exactly it. And this is the funny thing, and this was the point I was trying to make earlier. The funny thing, and I would always say this like in my lectures, is that when you actually prioritize a human need, the actualization of somebody, you don't need to force feed them addictive foods or drugs or whatever, because this is a need. This is part of somebody's evolutionary journey. There's actually real value in it.
If I come back to the Rising Research Framework, the calling is one of the top things. So calling, and then you think about character, capacity, coherence, and then creative will. So that's the framework that I've come up with. I would say from my point of view, I think I'm very much focused on the question of who we need to become to steward our desired futures. Who do we need to become to steward our desired futures? Thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your prayer at the beginning. And thank you for your generous offer. To anyone who's interested in pursuing that, just indicate to me, send me an email. And if you're interested in joining Ijeruka's community, if you're interested in our Rising Rooted Fellowship that's coming up, or the retreat later this year, we have a few retreats that are actually going to be happening in the coming months. The best thing to do is to just book a call. Just book a call. Go on the website and organize a call. We can talk about it and we can figure out what the best next step is for you. Follow Aisha on Instagram, Dr. Aisha Chioma. All right. Thank you so much.